Okay, welcome everybody as you're coming into the webinar today. Good to see the numbers building up. Welcome to our November webinar on maximising fundraising efficiency. While we're waiting for people to come in, my name is Dan Fletcher. I'm Director of the fundraising side of our advisory services, and it'd be good just to have a bit of interaction with everybody who's coming into this webinar. I was thinking it's the 4th of November, so it's nearly Guy Fawkes night, but who's getting ready for Christmas already? Who's got their Christmas presents lined up or done any of their Christmas shopping? We even got their Christmas parties organised. Perhaps put something into the chat to say, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how ready you are for Christmas. 1 being in denial until the 24th, 10 being all your presents wrapped up and everything and turkey almost ready to be cooked. Thought there's some chat coming in now. That's good. Nowhere near 1 and staying that way. Thank you, Davina. Somebody on a -1. Okay, that's maybe not so surprising. Somebody's on a Christmas work Zoom party. Last year in our team, we did a Zoom Christmas party as an escape room, and so there's not so many of us in the team, as you'll see in a moment, and we did this escape room with various interesting things that came into it. It was part of a series, and there was one point where one of the actors who was in the escape room came onto the screen and was talking to us, and then their doorbell went, and then they disappeared, and they never came back because we probably should have told them not to go and answer the door, because there was one of the baddies was at the door. So whenever we're on Zoom calls or Teams calls with our team now, and one person disappears, we're slightly worried whether they're going to come back or not. But that's maybe not such a good thing from an escape room Christmas do, but it's certainly memorable. Okay, so I think we've got people in the room now, and so we're going to kick off. Do put comments in the chat, and I'll get to those at the end. If you've got a specific question, put that into the Q&A, please, and then we'll have a Q&A session right at the end, and I'll be able to answer questions and take your comments at that point. So thank you for joining us today. As I said, this is a session on maximising fundraising efficiency. I'm Dan Fletcher, and I'm talking to you from Moorkings & Smith Non-Profit Advisory. Some of you won't be, or many of you won't be familiar with the term Moorkings & Smith Non-Profit Advisory, as we've just this week launched with a new name, a slightly different brand, but with the same people behind that were behind Moorkings & Smith Fundraising and Management. But I'll explain a little bit more about those changes in a moment. So without further ado, what we're going to go through today, some introductions, and then to spend some time thinking about efficiency. So I'll go through some efficiency measures that I think are useful and helpful to get into the topic. Then we spend a bit of time looking at the barriers that people need to overcome when looking at fundraising efficiency and trying to make it work in your organization. It's a good aspiration to be efficient in your fundraising, but there are often problems as to why that doesn't happen. Maybe it's not even problems to do with the fundraising team. And so I'm going to spend a bit of time looking at some of those barriers, and then come up and present a few models that I think are useful to think about in the wider picture of fundraising efficiencies. And sort of setting the scene in some ways. The reason we're thinking about this now is coming out of the hopefully the hardest part of the pandemic, finding a new way to, as we come out, and as we hopefully will emerge into what will become a post-pandemic era next year, maybe, or hopefully next year, or if not the one after. It's time to reevaluate where we are with our fundraising and how we respond to the new opportunities that are there, and also to the new ways of working, and to evaluate the old ways of working and how valid or useful they are. So it's in that context that I want us to think about fundraising efficiency today. But just some brief introductory comments. Firstly, Morkings & Smith, we're a mid-sized professional services firm, mainly working in the audit space for all sorts of organizations, including many charities. We do a lot of work with the charity sector, over 750 charity clients, 14 charity specialist partners. If you've been to these webinars before, you'll know all of this information, and you can find out more on the Morkings & Smith website. Just a little bit about the team that I'm in. So, as I said earlier, we're Morkings & Smith non-profit advisory now. We're non-profit because we do work with the charity sector, but we don't just work with the charity sector. We work with a range of non-profit organizations as well. They might be social enterprises, they might be educational organizations, but all of them share the fact that they while they may create a profit, they're not necessarily doing that in order to create profit for shareholders. They're creating, if they do create a profit, if they do sell things, it's to put that back into creating a social value. And as you can see here, we don't just do fundraising. My area is about raising more funds, but my colleagues, Penny, Helen and Carl, are involved in helping organizations demonstrate their impact, and Marcus and Mark helping organizations become more financially sustainable. And altogether, the six of us work with organizations to help them improve and develop their strategies as well. And we get involved in strategic planning. So that's just a little bit about us. Look out for more things from us as non-profit advisory, and you can find us on Twitter with our new handle at non-profit advice, which I was very pleased nobody else had taken before we picked it up a few months ago. Okay, so just some more sort of notices about us as a team. This session on maximising fundraising efficiency is, if you like, twinned with a training session, an education session planned for the 2nd of December, which will be in the morning, and that will be for up to 16 people. So we keep it nice and small, and it's an opportunity to look more deeply and intensely into the topic of fundraising efficiencies. We're doing the same thing with in January and February, looking at making the most of unrestricted reserves, and then an education session doing a deep dive into that with Mark and Marcus, and then in March doing the same thing but looking at social value with Carl, Helen and Penny, and then an education session to wrap that up at the end of March. And then after March, we'll have a new term of training sessions, which we'll tell you about in the new year. And do get in touch with us if you want to find out anything more about what we do, or to take advantage of one of our 30-minute free surgeries to talk about your non-profit challenges. So that's introductions about us. Moving on to think about fundraising efficiencies. As I said, I want to go through some of the issues, some of the big picture issues around efficiency, and then think about the barriers, and then think about some maybe a slightly different approach to metrics that you might want to take. And one of the things that in preparing this that I was thinking about was the fact that as in fundraising organizations, it's very easy to be busy and to take busyness as a good measure of efficiency. If all the team are busy, if they're busy doing stuff, if there's money coming in, if there's money being banked, then that means that you're being efficient and that you're being effective as well. And positive cash flows and being busy, staff utilization are good indicators, but they're not necessarily the best indicators to whether you're being as efficient as you could be. And one of the things that has come out of the pandemic and the relationship that the charities have with their donors during that time has been to really understand the importance of donor loyalty. It's not just about how many or whether you're measuring lots of gifts coming in, but what do those gifts tell you about the relationship between you and your donors, and where's that relationship going, and how can you think and measure that relationship in the future. So that's one of the things that we're going to be thinking about more when it comes to looking at efficiency metrics. And those sorts of metrics are often harder to quantify, but we'll have a go at doing that. So firstly, when thinking about efficiency measures for charities, to start off with, there may be three really important key metrics. You may be able to guess what they are. Maybe think what they are. I'm just going to go through them really quickly. The first one is obviously how much money have you raised? What's your fundraising income? If you don't know what your fundraising income is on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, then you won't really be able to measure anything to do with your efficiency. And sometimes that is a problem with fundraising charities, and I'll touch on some of those barriers a bit later on. That you're fundraising blind. You're asking lots of people for money, asking organisations for money, but you don't have a clear handle on how much is coming in for various maybe issues to do with communication within your organisation, or even the capacity to do the measuring, and knowing how much is going into the bank. The next thing is the number of donors that you have, and so how much money is coming in is important. How many donors you have is another key measure of how efficient, how effective you're being as a fundraising organisation. And whilst your number of donors doesn't have to grow to be more efficient, if it shrinks, then that's probably, well, that's definitely not a good sign, and you need to be thinking about what you're doing in order to get acquisition, to acquire new donors as well, and make sure that your number of donors isn't shrinking. And then the third metric is simply dividing the amount of income by the number of donors and looking at your average revenue per donor. And that's a good measure of how well you're doing. It was interesting, I saw today an email that came out from Blackboard, and they were asking how good is your ROI, your fundraising ROI, and you could plug in how much you'd raised and how many donors you had in this year or the last year, and then they had some metrics basically looking at what your average revenue per donor was and how that compared against other charities. So benchmarking against the data that they already had in their system. I prepared this slide deck bit before seeing that email, but I was very pleased that they were also focusing on these same three key metrics. And certainly understanding your average revenue per donor is a useful way of knowing how well you're doing. And thinking about efficiency, obviously we want to continue to be more efficient as fundraising charities. So there are also only really three things that you can try to do in order to increase efficiency. The first one is obviously to ask for more money. If the amount of money that you raise goes up, then that's one way of increasing both productivity and probably efficiency. The other thing that you can do is ask more people to give. And that's another way, obviously, which would hopefully result in increasing the amount of money that you have, but that would also potentially improve your efficiency as an organisation. And then bringing those two things together, you need to ask for even more money from more donors. Obviously, if you end up just asking for more money from more donors, your average revenue per donor may actually go down. Because you've got more people giving, and those more people may give lower amounts, so your total amount raised goes up, but your revenue per donor goes down. Ideally, what you want to be able to do is to increase your total income raised and also increase your average revenue per donor by getting those donors to grow in number and to give even more, to be more loyal to you as an organization. So these are three metrics that you need to be able to have a good handle on in your organization in order to understand how efficient you are being as a fundraising charity. But there are problems with sort of thinking about just those three measures by themselves, because one of the measures that's not in those three is how much does it cost. How much money are you spending in order to raise that money? And obviously, in a worst case scenario, if you're spending more money than you're raising, you may be effective in raising money, but you're not really doing you or your charity any favors, because you're spending more than you're bringing in. So that's a net loss. And so the return on investment quotient is something that that people often use, a ratio to work out total amount of money raised minus the amount that it cost to raise that money, divided by the cost that it raised to raise that money. So it shows you how many pounds you generate per pound spent on generating that funding in the first place. So that's an important, or can be an important or useful thing to get a handle on your efficiency. But there are some challenges with that as well, such as, what about the income and cost of generating a regular membership payment over a number of years? So when you're putting that sum together, the cost or the income minus the cost of raising that income divided by the cost of raising that income, how much income do you put in? Do you just put in the first year's membership payment, or this could be a direct debit for a regular giver? Do you just put in the first year divided by the cost of raising that, divided by minus the cost divided by the cost? That will show you a return on investment, but there may be many more years of value to come out of that, which you're missing out on. And then with the membership, are there likely to be ongoing costs of servicing that membership? You maybe send them a membership magazine each year. There may be other things that other costs that go into that. And hopefully that more than pays off in terms of the return that you're getting, but which bits of income do you put in? Which costs do you put in? Then what about with legacies? What about the income and the cost of generating a revocable decision to include a gift in someone's will? And I deliberately put a revocable decision there, because we may spend lots of money, or some money at any rate, trying to persuade somebody to give a gift in their will. But until they actually die and that will goes to probate, the charity doesn't get any money at all. So there's an investment, but there's no actual return on that investment. And the decision to be included in somebody's will is revocable, right up to just before the point of their death, I guess, technically. So even though you're in somebody's will and they've told you that you're in their will, they could change their mind. So you can work out your return on investment on legacy fundraising, but the proof in the pudding really isn't until you go to probate, and that might be many years away from when the investment went into trying to raise that money in the first place. Or what about the costs of increasing propensity to donate in the future when asked? So this is even a hidden positive value. So somebody hasn't given, but because of the work that you've done in order to the costs that you've incurred in order to encourage them to give in the future, they will give if you ask them, but they wouldn't have actually given. So there isn't an income value in your ROI, but there is a cost incurred in terms of the work that you've done to get them to that point where they will potentially give when asked. So how do you record that if all of those costs are in 1 year and then the giving that they're likely to make is in a subsequent year? Or if the act of fundraising has actually worked to increase the uptake of a non-profit organization's charitable services. So this is often tricky, where organizations are involved in fundraising, possibly to their own beneficiaries at the same time. And by talking about the work that the charity is doing, encouraging people to be generous towards those activities and to give, it actually increases the uptake of those charitable services. So it actually includes a cost to your organization. Where do those costs go in thinking about your fundraising efficiencies? Do you take them out completely from the cost base? And how can you work out all the time when an individual, a fundraiser, maybe a community fundraiser, is involved in having those kinds of conversations with all sorts of audiences, including beneficiaries, and those conversations sometimes will result in a gift, and sometimes will result in people taking up or using the charity's services. And all of these are very real issues that we've been finding with some of the clients we've worked with over the last year or two, and when it comes to helping them to think about their fundraising efficiencies. So I don't put them in here just as random examples, but these are all real things that have come up. I'm not going to give you specific examples right now, but when we look at some of the metrics, maybe some of the solutions will come into that. And then time is the other thing that comes into the equation, and I'm very sorry for those of you who didn't like algebra when you were at school and don't have degrees in maths. I'm not trying to put you off the thought of lifetime value or net present values, but this would just seem to be the simplest way of thinking through the equation, that rather than looking at return on investment, it may be more useful to think about the net present value of the work that you're doing to fundraise from particular groups or particular individuals or particular categories of donor. So you may want to think about what's the lifetime value that's going to come from that donor. Maybe that is part of the solution, where you've got memberships, where you've got ongoing giving, where you know that you don't just have a one-off donation and that's it. So what might the lifetime value of the donor be, or of a group of donors? And then what's the cost of acquisition, or the costs of acquisitions, and it may be multiple, and that cost may be over. Well, it probably is a one-off point, but if you're dealing with a group of individuals or a group of donors, then it might be a number of costs. And then there's the lifetime cost of cultivation. So how much are you going to spend in order to keep on generating the lifetime value that you hope to obtain from the donor? So that's the cost of membership magazines, or the cost of engagement events, or the cost of having a trust fundraiser in place who is sending reports back to a trust at a regular basis in order to encourage them to keep making a grant in the future. And all of those things, if you take the lifetime value, subtract from it the cost of acquisitions, and subtract from it the cost of cultivation, then you get the net present value of where you are with that particular donor or donor cohort. And looking at that net present value over time will help you to see how your efficiencies are changing, how they're improving, or maybe getting worse. And that gives you a real value of how efficient you're being, because it's taking a better account of the income and the costs and time, and where time fits into it as well. So I spent a bit of time looking at some of the big picture stuff on efficiency measures. Want to and possibly I've sort of gone into some of the barriers, but I want to spend a little bit more time thinking about some of the barriers. Maybe these are more cultural within your organization, and the barriers that you may need to overcome. And again, these are barriers that we've identified and experienced with organizations that we've been working with over the last year or so. So firstly, what about some of these issues? Do they sound familiar? Yeah, the general ledger that the finance team are using uses different nominal codes than those that the fundraising team uses to manage its activity. So you've got finance measuring income and expenditure with one system, and then you've got the fundraising team with a different system for measuring their activity, and never the twain do meet. Talking apples and oranges when it comes to comparing and contrasting. Or you've got complexities, maybe income is generated through a trading company. Maybe that's the right place for that income to be generated, because it's different to your, or it's kept separately from your charity's main business, or maybe income generated through a retail outlet, charity shop. So it should be within your trading company, but the expenditure that relates to that is kept within the charity's budgets, and so you've got two different sets of accounts. Two different ways of accounting for that money, and making it much more complicated to work out what your ROI is, or your net present value, or where your efficiencies are. Or the perennial problem of fundraising teams having efforts or activities which don't hit the bottom line of the budget of the part of the team that's doing the work, but that benefit another team. Often it's the community fundraisers who are working with the community, and maybe they're going to be talking and engaging with all sorts of different people. Some of those people may be running companies, and so the community fundraisers' efforts to persuade an individual to give may result in the corporate fundraising team's targets being hit, because it ends up with a company giving, but it was actually the community fundraiser who did all the work. How do you account for that easily within your charity? Or taking that one step further, then you've got different parts of the organization. Maybe marketing doesn't really sit within fundraising, or the costs that are incurred there are very different to the to the fundraising costs, and marketing does stuff for the other parts of the organization as well. But they clearly, there are some costs for their activities which need to be factored into the overall cost of fundraising for your organization, because they will have a benefit in terms of the income that gets raised. It's possible to account for those things, but not always easy. So a number of those issues relate to complex financial systems, and the key thing is to work out how you're going to unpick your business model in order to have a clear idea of what the flow of money is, the web of money, the costs that come in to affect the activities that you do, and where that money comes out, and in which part of your organization it comes out. And with that, you maybe need to think up either go with the apportionments that are already designed within your finance team, in order to account for overheads, to account for the marketing team's contribution to the fundraising team's activities, or even within your team's ways of working together, but acknowledging that different elements of community fundraising may be contributing to the corporate budget. Being able to pull apart the wires and to unpick your business model is going to be time consuming and may be tedious, but having a clear model of how it works, and working closely with finance to make that work is going to be invaluable, and is certainly something which we get involved with to help organizations to be able to understand where they're going, and what they can expect or what they shouldn't expect when it comes to presenting their fundraising efficiencies. So the next thing that you need to think about are internal politics, and this is really about breaking down those silos between different teams, and that's often about communication. Sometimes it's about incentives. Sometimes it's about understanding what those incentives are, or what the pressures are, and why certain teams, certain elements of your organization do things in different ways, to the ways that you would expect or understand. So that does mean that some fundraisers at least need to be able to learn the language of finance, and maybe help the finance team to learn the language of fundraising to some extent. It does mean that within your fundraising teams, you need to be able to work out a one fundraising approach rather than a very siloed approach, the bigger you are, the easier it is for silos to grow. And when they do grow, then inevitably, there will be an element of protectionism. There will be an element of misunderstanding, unless you work really hard to break down that culture and to ensure that everybody is incentivized for the whole fundraising target to be hit, to be met. Everybody is incentivized for there to be good communication between different fundraising teams. Everybody is incentivized to be able to share leads in order to help your beneficiaries ultimately by raising more money and being more efficient. But if you don't do that, then those silos will get in the way, and internal politics will really affect your efficiencies. And then the third thing is often around past decisions, legacy issues, and it's not legacy as in gifts and wills, but legacy issues in terms of how things used to be, possibly with staff who no longer, or people who are no longer working within your organization, who made decisions that have lost their validity a long time ago, but you're still working on that same way of doing things. I remember the same principle when I was younger. My dad was talking to his neighbour about a gate that we both shared into a garden, and the gate wasn't working so well. The gate post was starting to go rotten. The gate was starting to not hang on its hinges properly, and my neighbour, who was quite elderly, in response to my dad wanting to fix the gate, said, "Well, it's been there for 40 years. And it's been fine. I don't see why we need to do anything with it now." See, it had been there for 40 years, but it wasn't fine anymore. It wasn't really fit for purpose anymore. It was starting to rot. And just because something's been there for a while, we need to really be able to ask the question why, and be prepared to come up with an answer which maybe means change rather than just settling with the status quo. So sometimes that change is difficult. Sometimes that change involves uprooting systems that we've grown comfortable with. But if you're prepared to ask why, and now is with the pandemic changing so many things and shifting so many different ways of working, now is a great time to be asking why about almost everything that we do. Why do we need to do it that way? Why have we always done it that way? Why do we think that's the best way to fundraise, to respond to our donors, to provide them with the kind of services that they would expect from us as a non-profit organization? And if the answer to that why is wanting, then be ready to change and be ready to do things differently, because you really need to do that in order to not just survive moving forward, but in order to thrive and to continue to provide the kinds of services that your beneficiaries will need into the future. So those three areas: understanding your business models, dealing with cultural issues and silos, and also asking difficult questions about why, and being prepared to question the past, are all key things to helping you to be more efficient in your fundraising as well. So moving into the last section of our this presentation today, and I want to spend 10-15 minutes or so just thinking through some efficiency metrics that you might want to consider within your organizations, and then we'll have an open time of questions. So the first thing I want to talk about is the donor experience, and the donor experience is a way of looking at efficiency which doesn't really start with the numbers. Some of the things that I've talked about so far, it is all about the numbers. It's all about how much you raised, how many donors there are, what your average gift per donor is. The donor experience comes at it from a completely different angle. It's not looking at the numbers, it's looking at how your donors feel. And this sort of comes back to the point that I was just making about the importance of using the pandemic as an opportunity to really drill down deep into the essence of your fundraising in your organization, and not just to do the same old, but to really think about how that interacts with donors and what they get from that, and why they give to you in the first place. Pre-pandemic, there was quite a lot of work done on the donor experience. Some of you may be familiar with the Commission on the Donor Experience. You can find a lot of their findings and wealth of information on SOFI. That's SOFII.org. If you want to look that up after the webinar. And we'll include some links to the donor experience, or the Commission on the Donor Experience materials, in an email that will go out with this. Following this presentation, we'll give you a recording of the presentation, the slides, and some useful links. So do look into thinking about the donor experience. But here's some sort of snapshots around that. The first thing is to think about what donor loyalty is. Loyalty is more than just how satisfied a donor is with your organization. Donor satisfaction is important, but it's not the be all and end all. Just as in the for-profit world, companies can have a high customer satisfaction, but then end up being not very profitable for a whole bunch of different reasons. Donors may be satisfied with you as an organization, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're loyal. And that they'll continue giving. They may like what you do, but they may not be committed. And so you need commitment as well. You need to be sure that they understand the cause that you represent, and they're committed to helping your organization to continue to be able to satisfy that cause. And they need to trust you as well. And see, again, pre-pandemic, sort of in the early teenies, we had a range of issues around trust in charities and trust in fundraising in particular, and we saw donor trust, or people's trust in charities go down. Fortunately, that trust has seemed to be going up again. The Charity Commission's analysis of that shows that is improving, but it's still an area that we mustn't lose track of, and we need to be continually working hard to maintain donor trust. And when we get donor commitment, donor satisfaction, and donor trust right, then donor loyalty is high. But again, those are maybe subjective things that are hard to measure. So how do you do that? One way is looking at net promoter scores. That's a technique used by the for-profit world, basically asking people whether they would promote, or whether they would tell a friend or a member of their family about your organization in a positive light, whether they would recommend you to somebody else. And the more positive they're on a scale of 1 to 10, their inclination to recommend you, that's good. The more negative, obviously, or the lower to 1, that's bad. And you can work out what your net promoter scores would be by asking a bunch or a selection of your audience how likely they would be to recommend you to friends or family. And you can measure how those net promoter scores change, and that's one way to think about how donor loyalty is changing. You may want to use proxies. Possibly the fact that people notify you when they change their address means that they want you to continue writing to them, and so they're happy that they should continue to be a loyal donor to your cause. That's not a complete indicator. They may just be very administratively able, but it may mean that they really do like you as an organization. How they respond to surveys may be another proxy for how loyal they are to you as a donor, depending on how you ask the questions and how often you ask, whether they unsubscribe from e-newsletters that you send out to them, and how your unsubscribe rates are changing may also be a good proxy to how loyal your donors are to you. You need to think up those proxies for your own organization that are relevant, and then that's a good way to be able to measure donor experience. Then think about donor connections, and this is something which I don't think there's been a lot of work put into, but it's sort of picking up on the fact that, as I said, a community fundraising activity may lead to a corporate fundraiser or the corporate fundraising team receiving a donation. And there's always, in every charity that I've worked for, prior to becoming a consultant, there was always a number of unsolicited donations or anonymous donations. That in the database, the unsolicited or the anonymous donor was always the major donor that you had in an organization. And the number or the value of those unsolicited donations may be an indicator to some extent to how you're reaching a wider audience, and how the efforts that you're doing in fundraising are bearing fruit, even though you don't necessarily know what the attribution is, and you can't find that direct cause, because sometimes that direct line from asking and donation, it just isn't going to be there. It may be that there's a difference between the source and the appeal codes. So the source code where you acquired a donor, and the appeal code that they gave on may also be different. It may be that you didn't appeal to them in a certain way, but they still gave according to that appeal code, and somehow that appeal reached them in a way that you don't understand or don't know. How often does that happen? Can that be an indicator of your fundraising efficiencies? Or it's about measuring the different links that there are between a donor and your organization. I certainly know from corporate fundraising that the number of connections that you have with a corporate will always be indicative of the likelihood for that relationship to grow rather. If you've only got one connection with one member of that business's team, then that's maybe a pretty weak connection, and when that person leaves the organization, then your relationship is gone. If your connections are multiple, if you're dealing with the HR team and who are helping you provide volunteers, if you're dealing with the estates team who are helping to give you gifts in kind, maybe old desks that they don't need, or equipment that they want to give away. If you're dealing with marketing who are helping you to improve the way that you run your website, if you're working with the this corporate social responsibility team in order to generate donations from employees of that firm or whatever, then you've got more links into the organization, and you've got a much greater chance of a good and a long-standing relationship there. Your fundraising efficiency will be high. And the same is true maybe with major donors, with even with individual donors. If they're an individual but they're also a volunteer, also an activist campaigning for your organization, those number of links will indicate a greater efficiency to your fundraising. But do you record those things? Do you measure those links? And then conversations is another thing that can be useful when thinking about fundraising efficiencies. And this is something that's particularly come through legacy marketing, and a key trend in understanding how effective your legacy fundraising is by counting the number of conversations that happen between somebody connected to your charity and a potential legator. That may be volunteers or non-fundraisers who are talking about legacies to donors, and that only really helps, or only starts, if you empower those volunteers or fundraisers to do that talking. And you need to have simple feedback systems so you can measure how and when those conversations happen. And some of those conversations may be prompted, some of them may be unprompted. It's useful to know the difference between the two. But it's all about creating context where talking about giving is normalized. It doesn't just have to be talking about legacy giving, although obviously talking about legacy, getting people to talk about legacy giving is a very important thing to do, and changing the paradigm around that will be really valuable within your organization. And that's been the main mission of the Remember a Charity organization, part of the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, to change the way people think about legacies across the country. But changing the way people think about giving across the country is an important task for us as fundraisers as well. So do you know how those conversations are happening, and are you able to measure that? And then there's the issue of time. This graph, it's a little bit complicated. I'll just go over it very quickly. The scale on there is logarithmic in order to be able to include the long time span for legacy giving. But to see the blue line there shows how with legacy giving, for example, the return on investment is very high, 30 to 1, perhaps is an average which you could expect, but it takes time. You can't expect to ask somebody to leave a legacy and for it to happen and for the money to arrive in the charity's bank accounts very quickly. The average is about 7 years, but for many it's going to be many more years between deciding to leave a gift in their will as a result of being asked and that will come into probate and then arriving in your charity's bank account. So the graph goes up very, very slowly, goes very high, and then it comes down. And indeed, it could go on a lot further than 20 years. I've stopped it there just to make the graph manageable. Whereas for something like individuals, you may ask pretty quickly with a direct mail appeal. The message goes out, the appeal goes out, and within a few months, you'll have had the bulk of your return on that investment come back in the form of donations. But the return may be only around 5 to 1, as opposed to the 30 to 1 that you would get with legacies. And then there are other forms of fundraising in between. The point being there, though, that a number of those forms of fundraising have a return after the financial year. And that's often difficult to account for within an organization that looks at things, looks at budgets on a 1 year at a time basis. So how do you plan for that in the long term? Maybe you could think about estimating your return on investment over different financial years. And I'll show you a little bit more about how that might work in a moment. It's also partly about mindset. It's about thinking of fundraising expenditure as an investment rather than a cost. And an investment is something that you would do over you look to invest over a number of years and see that return come back over a number of years. And if you're using the net present value model, as I talked about earlier, you do need to be allowing for all of those donor development costs over time as well. So really time has to be factored in, both in terms of income and in terms of expenditure. So how might this look? I've got a dashboard here, which you might have in an organization to look at those 4 different metrics. You might find a way of measuring donor loyalty. Perhaps it's like a speedometer. I've got a red line there, which is your target, the sort of level of donor loyalty that you're hoping for, and then the indicator, the speedo, suggests how fast you're going or how close to that target you're getting. Your connections, so that's going to be different for different sorts of fundraising. So for trust fundraising, for example, you would hope that you'd have almost full attribution in terms of knowing what you've done in order to solicit or how you've solicited for a gift and the gift that's arrived. Generally, there's full attribution. You ask for, you send in a grant application, and hopefully you're successful, and the money comes back. For legacies, it's almost the opposite. Often charities, legacies come in, they're pennies from heaven, or not pennies, money from heaven. They don't know why or how the donor decided to include them in their will. They don't have a way of attributing that at all. So you can come up with a red line there, which indicates what your target is, and then you can try and find ways to measure that along the way in order to work out how close you are to your target and whether that's good or whether that's bad. And so I've broken that down by different forms here. So your trust's attribution levels are maybe higher there than you'd expect, and that might be a good thing. Your legacies there may be lower than you'd expect. That also might be good. That might mean that you're doing lots of things in order to encourage people to leave legacies. You don't know what all of those are, and you maybe need to bring your attribution target a bit lower. And then there are conversations. You can come up with in the red, the target for how many conversations you have each quarter, and then try and find ways to measure those and see how that changes over time. And then the return on investment contribution over time. You might aim for for your cost this year to have a 5.9 target in terms of return on investment. but that the way that pans out is only 3.5 of that is the return this year, 1.9 is next year, 0.5 is the year after, and 0.4 is the year after that. And that sums to 6.2. So you may not be able to see that so clearly on the dashboard there. But that 6.2 is actually above your target, even though in year one the return that came back was only 3.5. And that's the way to factor in time as well in your return on investment. So there are some thoughts on metrics and on ways of maybe shifting the dial, so to speak, in measuring different things, which help you to understand your efficiencies in ways that are perhaps more valuable than the current systems that you use. So now I want to try and see if we have any questions from you now that I've given the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. It'll help me also to be able to see what's in what sort of questions or comments are there. I can see that David Robb has asked a question. Are you including fundraisers as donors? That's an interesting one. I guess I hadn't, but that is worth thinking about. That your fundraisers should indeed be donors as well, and that. And just sort of thinking about that. One of the best ways of really getting to grips with how efficient you are is understanding what it's like to be a donor for your charity. If your fundraisers are also donors to your charity, then they're going to have that donor experience as personal experience as well, and that's maybe a really good way. Sometimes you can use a mystery shopping sort of process to find out how good you are as an organization when it comes to asking for funds. But rather than mystery shopping, if all your fundraisers are donors as well, then that's a great way of being able to really feel what it's like to be a donor, and to try and make sure that you feel as good as possible about donating to your organization. The same side of things should be true with trustees who might be donors, and ideally your trustees would be donors, and understanding from them what they feel about your efficiency as an organization and how that could be improved is also worth thinking about and worth asking. Yeah, that's something that you might want to consider. I see there's a question about recommendations for escape rooms, but I'll come to that right at the end. The other things in the chat were to do with Christmas. So Annie, you've asked where could we find some typical figures to compare with others, or a rough way to benchmark ourselves against other charities, whether return on investment or net present value, or another rough place to start. So thank you, Annie, for that question. The little diagram that I showed just towards the end with those graphs, those are sort of based on typical figures that are within the sector, which don't change hugely from year to year. So I was sort of looking there at legacies being sort of a 30-to-1 ratio, direct marketing appeals are sort of a 5-to-1 ratio, trust fundraising being sort of around the 10-to-1 ratio, return on investment ratio, and major giving maybe even being better than that, whereas other things like community fundraising or events fundraising being much lower down, the 2-to-1 or maybe lower than 2-to-1. So those are typical figures, but it's always difficult at times to be able to know how those typical figures have a real bearing on your organization, because each charity is different. You have different audiences, different causes, different capabilities to fundraise in terms of the staff that you've got, and the experience that you have. And also those figures generally referred to mature fundraising programs. So if you're introducing a new program, you maybe don't expect to have such a good return at the beginning as you would as that fundraising stream matures. So I'd certainly encourage organizations to certainly think about return on investment, but don't bust the gut over it in terms of making sure that you're exactly hitting that 10-to-1 ratio for trusts or that 30-to-1 ratio for legacies. What is often more helpful is to compare how you're doing 1 year to the next, to be able to make sure that you're measuring the same way from 1 year to the next in terms of what figures you're putting in the cost and what figures you're putting in the income, and to set yourselves targets and see how you can improve or change. Because the other factor that is obviously very difficult to manage from one charity to another is which costs do they include in the return for investment ratios or the net present value ratios? Do they include all costs? Do they apportion properly for the costs of the chief executive in terms of major giving and meeting with donors, or do they exclude that? Do they include all the costs of the communications team in the marketing that it does to promote the organization and the organization's fundraising, or not? Or when you're looking at different channels, do you include all community fundraising costs when some of those are actually should be attributed to the corporate fundraising team because the activity resulted in a corporate fundraising win? Those sorts of decisions are going to be arbitrary from one charity to the next. So it's important to not be too worried about looking at the overall sector trends and look at your own trends within your organization more, or find a similar organization to yours and buddy up and see whether you can compare and contrast your figures with theirs. Work to the similar sort of methodology when it comes to calculating and then see how those benchmarks work from year to year. That's certainly something that I'd recommend. But also think about some of those other metrics that may be a more far-reaching. Looking at donor loyalty, for example, that will help you to understand how people are going to give in the future, rather than understanding how they gave in the past. Loyalty is an indicator of future giving, whereas ROI is always a rear view mirror measure, and not one that necessarily tells you what performance is going to be like in the future. So we're almost up to time. I can take one more question if anybody wants to put that into the Q&A box. But if not, then if you're interested in looking at this in a bit more detail, and we've had a number of people sign up already to the education session that's happening in December the 2nd, then do sign up for that. It's only £99 plus VAT. So for a half day's training, we feel that's pretty good value for money, and it gives you the opportunity to meet with other like-minded charity leaders and to network with them as well, so that we feel that there's the added value of learning from other people, as well as exploring the topic more deeply and understanding how that applies to your organization. There will be an email that will go out to everybody after today, once we've downloaded the video and got all the details together. So that will either be tomorrow or Monday, hopefully. So you'll have all of this information to hand to look at, and yeah, hopefully you'll find that useful. But to look at the resources that go with that email, and do come back to me or to our team if you have further questions and want to know any more about understanding how to maximize fundraising efficiency, how to continue to raise more money. So it's nearly 5 o'clock now. I'm going to thank you very much for listening, and go and be great fundraisers and raise lots of money for your causes. Thank you very much.